Okay, well, hopefully that's everyone back, and we've got 50 people here this evening. How very delightful. 50 of us is a really, really lovely start to the new year. Yes, and it's the start to our new sort of theme or topic for the next 6 weeks, as Jyoti was saying earlier. We're going to be looking at a couple of the parables from the White Lotus Sutra. So what I'm going to do this evening, I'm going to begin by giving a very brief introduction to the White Lotus Sutra, and then I will tell the story, the parable that we're going to look at this evening, which is called the Parable of the Burning House. And then I'll just pull a few things out from that, just sort of, explore a few things. And then we'll go into our groups to talk about, what might have resonated for us or any of our experiences, really. So, excuse me, my mouth is very dry. I'm just going to take a sip of barley cup for those of you who are interested. So, the White Lotus Sutra. The Siddharma Pundarika Sutra, to give it its full title, which translates directly as Wonderful Dharma Lotus Flower Sutra. And sutra just means teaching, Buddhist teaching. And I have a copy just here. This copy is just called the Lotus Sutra, actually, but it's most commonly known as the White Lotus Sutra. It's thought to have been composed over the course of 150 to 200 years, around the 1st century BCE. It's a very, very popular sutra, particularly in Japan and China, and sort of all around the Southeast Asia. It's very well known, a lot of contemplation, reflection, a lot of commentaries written on it. It's the earliest Mahayana sutra, Mahayana being the second of the great schools or the second of the great movements of Buddhism. And it marks a radical change from the Pali Canon. So the Pali Canon is the earliest recorded Buddhist teachings. It's the first sort of set of teachings written down, passed down from an oral tradition and written down. That forms sort of one set of teachings, and then this sutra comes in, and it's very different. It's a radical change. It's almost entirely, the White Lotus Sutra is almost entirely non-conceptual. That's to say, it's story, image, and myth. And Bhante Sangha, the founder of our movement, our teacher, he says, the White Lotus Sutra explores the Dharma through parables, myths, and symbols. In other words, through archetypes, through what Jung calls the collective unconscious. And I was just going to read a bit of what Bhante says. So the language of concepts is the language of intellectual and rational thought, the language of science and philosophy. But the language of images is the language of the imagination, the language of emotions, is the language of poetry, the language of myth and symbol, simile and metaphor. Concepts address the conscious mind, but images appeal to the unconscious depths that, as modern psychology has made us aware, are within us all. He goes on to say, the White Lotus Sutra therefore appeals not to the head, but to the heart, not to the intellect, but to the imagination. And he says, and the atmosphere of the sutra is very strange. It's an atmosphere of miracle and marvel. And that's from The Drama of Cosmic Enlightenment, which is Bhante Sangharakshita's commentary on the White Lotus Sutra. So again, as last week, as for those of you who were here last week, we're in the realm of poetry, myth, and symbol. And Jnanavacha, I listened to a few talks on the White Lotus Sutra to help me prepare for this. Jnanavacha says about myth, symbol, parable, they're trying to get beneath our rational and conceptual minds to point to a deeper truth than is normally accessible to reason alone. And as I said last week, you know, Bhante is very clear that we need to engage both our rational side and our unconscious side in the spiritual life if we're to be really fully engaged, have all our energies engaged in the spiritual life. And one thing that stood out for me that Bhante pulls out of the White Lotus Sutra is that at one point the Buddha says, through a parable, intelligent people reach understanding. Through a parable, intelligent people reach understanding. And Virya Jyoti and I had a bit of a discussion about this, because I said, oh, I really like that. And she was like, I'm really not sure about that. And we found out we had very different takes on it. And her take was, I think, to do with the use of the word intelligent, really. And obviously that's a translation that somebody would have chosen to translate a particular phrase as intelligent. And she felt that it could be interpreted as, you know, you need some kind of high IQ or intellect in order to be able to reach understanding through parables, which is, well, hopefully, as you've sort of picked up from what I've just been saying, the absolute opposite in a way of what you do need for sort of really reaching an understanding or sort of feeling your way into something around a parable. For me, that statement, through a parable, intelligent people reach understanding, reminds me a bit of my former self. My former self, who thought that stories and myth and legends were a bit childish, a bit silly, a bit they don't really mean anything. It's like, yeah, all right, let's get on to the real stuff. Sort of, there's definitely a part of me that was quite resistant to the idea of, you know, real meaning being gained from stories, actually, things that weren't what I conceived to be factually true. And for me, this is saying, you know, that isn't the case. This is, you know, it's, stories are for intelligent people, not, yeah, I've probably said enough about that. I have to say I've completely done a 180-degree turn on my former beliefs about stories and parables. They're some of the richest sources for me of inspiration and understanding of myself these days. So I think it's really important how we approach a parable, a story, a parable, sorry, I meant to say earlier on, a parable is a short story that illustrates a truth. I think that was roughly what the Collins Dictionary said, something like that, or a religious teaching, or a moral teaching. But I quite liked the illustrating a truth. So yeah, how do we approach these parables? And Bhante suggests we let the parable sink in and we dwell in parts of the story. We dwell in parts of the story. And Virya Jyoti, in her sort of looking into the subject, she came across this fantastic podcast by this Zen priestess called Domya, who's talking about the White Lotus Sutra. And she suggests dreaming your way into it, which I just love. Dreaming your way into it. What does it feel like? I'm really trying to refrain from leaping to a literal interpretation. Just imagine yourself in it, dwell on the images, reflecting on it, just being with it and not rushing to an intellectual understanding, like, oh, this means this, oh, okay, yeah, that means that. It's so, well, maybe not in all of us, it's so strong in me to want to do that. My rational mind wants to understand, to kind of compartmentalize. And there's a place for that, of course. And there's a place for just opening up and looking at things and feeling things a bit differently. And again, it's, you know, what I was saying last night, keeping an open mind. There's new ways of knowing things. Maybe there's new ways of knowing things. There's new experience to be had. There's always more to learn. The White Lotus Sutra quite famously starts with the Buddha. He's on a peak and he's talking to a massive crowd of people, and he says, look, I've got this new thing to talk to you about. You've got more, there's more I can tell you here. And it is said that 500 arhats, so 500 sort of quite spiritually realized people at this point got up in disgust and left, because they couldn't cope with the idea that they didn't know everything. They felt they knew everything. They didn't want to hear any new teachings. They got up and they left. And I just, what a missed opportunity for those arhats. So those spiritual practitioners really missed out on something there. So yeah, let's not be disgruntled arhats. So I'm just going to tell the story, the parable of the burning house now. It's very short. Sit back, get yourselves comfortable. I'm going to have another swig of barley cup before I begin. So, a long time ago, in a land far away, there lived a very rich man. He was also a very old man. He was very wealthy, and he had a lot of lands and property, and he had this house, and it was a very large house, probably what we would think of as like a mansion. It had really big rooms, lots of rooms, many stories, sort of sweeping staircases going up, probably lots of staircases going to different parts of the house. It was really quite something. At least it probably was quite something. However, this house is in a state. This house is decaying. It's rotting away. The floorboards are rotten. The plaster, bits of plaster falling off the ceiling. I imagine if you try walking up the stairs, you'd be worried about leaning on the stair rail and it giving way. There's it's very old, just kind of uncared for. There's holes in the roof. There's all kinds of leaks, and yeah, it's just in a very bad state of repair and has been for quite some time, this house. And if that wasn't enough, there's also quite a few sort of dark corners in this house. And they're dwelling in there are, well, there's quite a lot of animals, I should say, roaming around, various animals. And maybe in those darker corners of the house, there are some ghosts, there are some demons, there are some sort of forces in there lurking around. So that's the house that this elderly rich man owns. There's one gateway in and out of the house. And quite a lot of people live in this house. You might be surprised to hear this, but quite a lot of people live in this house, including 20, maybe even 30 of the old man's children. They're living in this house. And then, as if that wasn't quite enough, a fire breaks out in the house. And you can imagine if you've got a lot of old rotting dry wood, it just goes vroom. You get this massive kind of conflagration of flames. The house is ablaze and the children are inside the house. The old man, when at the time the fire starts, is outside the house, and he can see the flames crackling away, consuming the house, and he realizes that his children are inside that house. And you might be able to imagine his anxiety, his worry, his fears for the safety of those children. And so, of course, what he does is he calls to them. He says, "Children, get out of the house. It's on fire. You are in danger. Get out of the house now." They do not hear him. Or maybe they do hear him and they choose not to heed him. They just ignore him. They're playing their games. They're very absorbed with their games, with maybe they've got some toys there as well. They're just kind of taken up in that, and they don't heed the warning of their father to get out of the house. They are in danger. And the father thinks, well, actually, I'm quite strong enough. Maybe I could go in and like haul them out one by one. But then he realizes, well, actually, that's no good. I'm never going to be able to get them all out and safe in time. That's just not going to work. And again, you can imagine he's getting frantic by now. These children are not listening to what he's saying. They're in more and more danger as every moment passes. You know, the fire is raging. And he has an idea. And he calls to the children again and he says, "Children, if you come out of the house, I've got fantastic toys for you. I've got new, amazing toys. I've got goat carts, deer carts, and ox carts." Now that might not sound that great to you now, but I think back in India in those days, they would be the bee's knees of toys for children, or diversions maybe. The children hear this. Interestingly enough, they hear this and instantly they leap up and they come running out of the house. They're kind of pushing and shoving each other to get out of the house quickly, to get their hands on these promised goodies, these promised carts. And so they get out of the house and they're standing, I guess in the fresh air. I don't know, that it doesn't mention that they turn around and perhaps look at the house and think, "Ooh, that was burning," but maybe they do. Maybe they do. So they're standing there and they go, "Okay, Father. Okay, Dad. Please give us the presents that you promised us. Please give us these carts." And the wealthy man is very happy to give them these carts. But he doesn't give them goat carts or deer carts. He gives them the absolute top of the range, best cart possible. He gives them these carts. They're really lofty and tall. They are decorated. They're encrusted with jewels and precious metals. They've got beautifully sumptuous, soft cushions covered in beautiful coloured silks. They've got railings around the edge, bells on each corner. They're quite something, and they're pulled by two sleek white oxen who are said to be completely sure-footed and as fast as the wind. And so these children each get into their cart, absolutely delighted with what they've got. And then they are free to roam and play in the air. I imagine them with the wind on their faces. So that's it. That's the parable of the burning house. So that's the story, or one telling of the story, my particular telling of the story on this particular evening. You'll probably notice we're going to retell this parable over the next couple of weeks, and it will be different each time. So, having encouraged you to dream your way into the story, to not search for answers, I'm going to spend a bit of time just pulling out a few symbols, a few sort of possible resonances, echoes from the story, simply dwelling in the house itself. This evening we're just going to focus on the burning house. If your rational mind is going into meltdown at this point, I will also give a little bit of an explanation of what the Sutra itself says about the meaning of the burning house. So it'll be a little bit of both. And again, I really invite you to just notice your response to any of the images or any of the ideas that I'm expressing. So houses, especially big houses. This is a big kind of mansion of a house. They can be a symbol of wealth, success, power, prosperity, maybe something that we might aspire to. I can imagine that we all value having what we say as a roof over our heads. And houses, homes might bring to mind safety and warmth, a haven, a refuge, maybe even a symbol of permanence, possibly. The story of the three little pigs came to my mind. You know, you've got those three houses. You don't want your house made of straw or sticks, but bricks. You know that it's solid, it's there, it will keep you safe from the wolves of the world. But this house clearly isn't a house of that variety. It's in a state, maybe once it was grand, but now it's in a real process of decay. It's crumbling, the floorboards are breaking, bits are falling off the ceiling. And maybe just take a moment to imagine what it might be like to actually be in such a house. Maybe just imagine yourself standing in a house where you probably need to be careful where you stand. The floorboards could break at any time. It's got dark corners in it. I'm not quite sure what's going on in those dark corners. It's crumbling all around. Just feeling our way into what that might feel like. So this house, I think we can safely say this house is impermanent. This house is insubstantial, and it is unsatisfactory. It's a place of, you know, it's a dangerous, risky place, actually. And yet all these children and all these people are living in it. All these people are dependent on it for shelter. There are ghosts in this house, maybe ghosts of grief or loss. Bhante suggests an idea of being haunted by the past. Our present can be shaped by what's happened in the past, perhaps by the stories we tell ourselves that kind of stay with us, haunting us. And Padmavajra, another talk I listened to, in his talk on this parable, he mentions our bodies as houses. You know, our bodies are dwelling places for us. And I think we can see, well, certainly in my experience, my body is a place of impermanence, constant flux and flow. And it can be at times a real source of pleasure and deeply unsatisfactory, particularly when it gets sick. So, as if all of that isn't enough, the house catches fire. And the danger becomes even more imminent. Impossible to ignore, or so you might think. So the house is on fire, flames, heat, crackling, huge energy in flames. Fires aren't static things, are they? They're dynamic, moving things. The house is ablaze. And so in the White Lotus Sutra itself, after he's told the parable of the burning house, the Buddha likens it to our world. And he says this. He says, there is no safety in the threefold world. By threefold world, he means this world, the samsaric world, the world of conditioned existence, impermanence, unsatisfactoriness, insubstantiability. It's not a word, unsubstantiability. There is no safety in the threefold world. It is like a burning house, replete with a multitude of sufferings, truly to be feared, constantly beset with the griefs and pains of birth, old age, sickness and death, which are like fires, raging fiercely and without cease. And in another Buddhist scripture, this is a sutta actually from the Pali Canon, that early teaching that I mentioned, probably not going to pronounce this right, the Aditta Pariyaya Sutta, or the fire sermon. It says this: the all is a flame with what? A flame with the fire of passion, the fire of aversion, the fire of delusion. So in other words, all is burning with the fires of greed, hatred, and delusion. And I just had a thought in the meditation, just in the first half, that you could see the house as impermanence, insubstantiality, and unsatisfactoriness, the sort of rotting house. And then it's like the greed, hatred, and delusion are like the kerosene poured on top of it that kind of causes this massive conflagration of fire. And you hear that said, don't you? You hear people say the world is on fire. And I think we can all experience that on different levels. So my world was on fire today as I literally poured boiling water over two of my fingers. The pain was quite intense, and I would say deeply unsatisfactory. And my aversion to it, my aversion to the pain, made it all the more worse. In a way, it made it all the more worse. Made it worse. It's like it kind of fueled the flames of that pain. Was being really upset that I'd burnt my fingers and I didn't want the pain. It's feeling much better now, just in case you're worried. And that's a very, that's a small example in a way. And I think we all have multitudes of these experiences in our lives, and much more serious experiences than that as well. I imagine to a certain extent we've all experienced sickness, death, pains and griefs in our own lives. And of course, you can look around in the wider world at everything around us. Any news day, things are pretty shocking. The volume of suffering is pretty shocking. The wars, the famines, of course, the pandemics. And the world is at times literally burning. You think about the bushfires from last year, you know, our world is literally burning. And for me, the parable of the burning house, it asks questions of me. And the burning house asks questions of me. And I'm reminded, I had quite a lot of songs come to me when I was thinking about this talk. You'll probably be relieved to know that I'm only going to mention one of them. I'm reminded of the 1987 song by Aussie rockers, Midnight Oil, for anybody who remembers, Beds Are Burning, which was apparently originally about Aboriginal people being forced off their lands, which I didn't know before I looked it up, but it's been taken up as an anti-climate change sort of anthem. But it asks the question, how can we sleep while our beds are burning? How can we sleep while our beds are burning? And I really feel that this is a question the parable is asking us. It's certainly asking me. So how can I see the suffering in the world? And how can I see the greed, the hatred and delusion in my mind and not really take any notice? Artist Siddhi mentioned last week about coronavirus. Of course, a situation that we're still all very much in. And he was sort of saying how when it first came along, everything stopped. And possibly we were confronted by a real glimpse of reality, by a real glimpse of the impermanence, the unsatisfactoriness of the world that we're living in. You know, very clearly, everything isn't all right, actually. The suffering is very clear. It was difficult to ignore. And then, how quickly do we go back to our routines? How quickly do we go back to our sort of new normal that shuts out what's really going on? What are our responses to it? And we can obviously, we're still very much in that situation. What are our responses? What other options might we have to a wake-up call like that? It's a bit like you might see the sort of the advent, for want of a better word, of coronavirus as the flames suddenly going up on the house. It's like, or suddenly burning much brighter. And of course, that's the other symbolism of fire. Fire can be a symbol of transformation. It's an opportunity for change. Fire has an energy, a dynamism. We have the expression in our dedication ceremony, in Sri Ratna, the flames that transmute samsara into nirvana. So the flames that can, transformation that can take us from suffering to a complete release of suffering. And it's interesting, isn't it, that nirvana is sometimes referred to as an extinguishing. And so it's really important to remember that the White Lotus Sutra, the whole of the White Lotus Sutra, very optimistic about the possibility of freedom from this situation, as is this parable. You know, the children get out, the children have these beautiful carts and they have the wind on their faces. And Virya Jyoti is certainly going to be picking up on this next week, looking at the children and the call that they hear and the way out of the burning house. But for now, in our groups, I suggest let's dwell a little in the burning house? How does it feel, the burning house? What does it bring up for you? Is it just too painful to look at? Does it feel overwhelming? What is your response? So yeah, one of the questions that the people facilitating your group will have is, do you see or feel any aspects of the burning house in your life? And what might your response be to those?